October 25th, 1944. 0300 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Commander Ernest Evans gripped the bridge rail of USS Johnston as his destroyer charged headlong into the most powerful naval formation the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever assembled. Around him spread the massive silhouettes of 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The enemy fleet displaced more than 700,000 tons of warships, bristling with guns, ranging from 5-inch to the colossal 18.1-inch rifles of the super battleship Yamato. Against this armada stood 6 American escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The mathematics of destruction were written in steel tonnage and gun caliber, and every calculation pointed to annihilation. What Evans could not have known, what none of the American sailors racing towards certain death could have imagined, was that they were about to witness the birth of a legend. A single Fletcher-class destroyer would absorb punishment that would have sunk 3 conventional warships, fight for 6 continuous hours against impossible odds, and in her final moments teach the world what American naval engineering could accomplish when pushed beyond every design limit. This is the story of USS Johnston, designation DD-557, and the morning she refused to die. To understand what Johnston accomplished on October 25th, you need to understand what she was before that dawn engagement transformed her from warship to legend. Laid down at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation on May 6, 1942, Johnston represented the pinnacle of American destroyer design. The Fletcher class embodied everything the United States Navy had learned about destroyer warfare through 2 years of brutal Pacific combat. At 376 feet in length and displacing 2,325 tons at standard load, she carried 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns in single turrets, 10 21-inch torpedoes, tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, and an array of anti-aircraft weapons that could shred attacking aircraft. But specifications tell only part of the story. The real story lay in the revolutionary construction techniques that made Johnston virtually indestructible. Her hull featured longitudinal framing with closely spaced transverse bulkheads, creating a honeycomb of watertight compartments. The electrical systems were triply redundant with emergency circuits routing through separate conduits. The machinery spaces were compartmentalized to prevent single hits from disabling propulsion. Every vital system had backup systems, and every backup system had alternatives. The men who would crew Johnston were equally exceptional. Commander Ernest Evans assumed command on October 27, 1943, bringing with him the combat experience of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. Evans was Cherokee, one of the few Native American officers to command a major warship during World War II. His leadership style was aggressive, direct, and utterly fearless. During the commissioning ceremony, he addressed his crew with words that would prove prophetic. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. The crew that remained represented the finest products of American naval training. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Carr had scored expert ratings on every weapons system aboard. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, the gunnery officer, could calculate firing solutions faster than the mechanical computers. Radioman First Class Joseph McCrane could maintain communications under conditions that would silence lesser operators. These were not raw recruits learning their trade. These were professionals who understood their equipment intimately and trusted their ship completely. Johnston's shakedown cruise in the Caribbean revealed capabilities that exceeded her design specifications. During gunnery trials, her 5-inch guns achieved rates of fire approaching 20 rounds per minute, nearly twice the standard rate. Her radar systems could track surface targets at ranges exceeding 40,000 yards. Her sonar equipment could detect submarines at depths previously considered impossible. Most importantly, her damage control systems proved capable of containing flooding, fire, and structural damage simultaneously. By June 1944, Johnston had joined Task Unit 77.4.3, known throughout the fleet as Taffy 3. The unit consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Their mission was providing close air support for ground forces on Leyte, while screening the vulnerable carriers from submarine and air attack. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, supporting amphibious operations far from major fleet actions. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were not fleet carriers. They were converted merchant hulls carrying 30 aircraft each, designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support. USS Gambier Bay displaced 11,000 tons and carried no armor. USS St. Lo was equally vulnerable. USS White Plains, USS Kalinin Bay, USS Fanshawe Bay, and USS Kitcon Bay completed the formation. Together, the 6 carriers represented the aviation assets supporting American ground forces on Leyte. The destroyer escorts accompanying Johnston were equally light. USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, and USS Dennis provided additional screening, but carried only 5-inch guns and limited torpedo armament. Against conventional threats, submarines and aircraft, Taffy 3 was adequately protected. Against surface ships, they were helpless. What none of the American commanders knew was that Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had survived the previous day's air attacks and was approaching Leyte Gulf at high speed. The Japanese formation included battleships Yamato and Nagato, each carrying 16-inch guns. Heavy cruisers Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, and Tone added 8-inch weapons to the formation. The destroyer screen provided additional 5-inch guns and torpedo capability. This was the most powerful surface force the Japanese Navy could assemble, designed specifically to destroy American amphibious forces. At 0630 hours on October 25th, lookouts aboard USS St. Lo spotted masts on the horizon to the northwest. Initially identified as friendly forces, the contacts were quickly recognized as hostile when the distinctive pagoda superstructures of Japanese battleships became visible. Admiral Sprague immediately ordered his formation to reverse course and called for air support, but the nearest fleet units were hundreds of miles away. Taffy 3 was alone. Commander Evans received the contact report at 0635 hours. Standing on Johnston's bridge, he could see the massive enemy formation emerging from the morning haze. The Japanese ships were approaching at 25 knots in battle formation, with battleships leading and cruisers flanking. Their guns were trained forward, ready to engage. In minutes, they would be within range of the vulnerable escort carriers. Evans faced a decision that would define his place in naval history. Naval doctrine called for destroyers to screen carriers with smoke while the formation retreated. The destroyer escorts would provide anti-aircraft protection while the carriers launched their aircraft. It was a defensive posture designed to preserve forces until help arrived. Evans looked at the approaching Japanese formation and made a different choice. "All ahead, flank speed," he ordered. "Left full rudder, general quarters, all hands to battle stations." Johnston surged forward, her 2 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding superheated steam to her General Electric turbines. The destroyer accelerated past 35 knots, white water cascading from her bow as she charged directly at the Japanese formation. Behind her, the other destroyers of the screen hesitated, waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague. Those orders came at 0640 hours. Small Boy's attack was transmitted across the formation, using the informal term for destroyers and destroyer escorts. The order meant immediate torpedo attack against the Japanese heavy units, a mission that was essentially suicidal against such overwhelming opposition. But Johnston was already attacking. Evans had made his decision before receiving official orders, trusting his instincts and his ship's capabilities. The destroyer raced toward the enemy formation at maximum speed, her guns training on the leading heavy cruiser. At 18,000 yards, still beyond effective range of her 5-inch weapons, Johnston opened fire. The first salvos fell short, sending up towering columns of water between the destroyer and her targets. Evans ordered continuous fire, knowing that even ineffective gunnery would force the Japanese ships to maneuver and disrupt their attack formation. Johnston's guns fired as rapidly as the crews could load, their muzzle flashes illuminating the morning darkness. The Japanese response was immediate and devastating. Every ship in the enemy formation that could bear on Johnston opened fire simultaneously. The water around the destroyer erupted in geysers as 8-inch and 16-inch shells bracketed her position. The noise was indescribable, a continuous thunder that drowned out orders and shook the ship's structure with each near miss. Evans continued closing range, weaving Johnston through the forest of shell splashes with ship handling that bordered on miraculous. At 15,000 yards, the destroyer's 5-inch guns began finding targets. Her shells struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, starting fires on the forward superstructure. The hits were too light to cause serious damage, but they demonstrated that Johnston could fight back. At 12,000 yards, Evans ordered a hard turn to starboard, unmasking Johnston's torpedo battery. The two quintuple mounts trained toward the Japanese formation as the ship steadied on her attack course. Fire control solutions were calculated manually as the mechanical computers struggled to keep pace with the rapidly changing geometry. The moment arrived at 06:45 hours. "Fire torpedoes," Evans ordered. 10 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes launched from Johnston's tubes, their compressed air systems driving them toward the enemy formation at 45 knots. Each torpedo carried a 643-pound Torpex warhead capable of breaking a cruiser's back. The weapons spread in a fan pattern, covering multiple targets across the Japanese formation. Johnston immediately reversed course, laying smoke to obscure her position as Japanese gunfire intensified. The destroyer had committed herself completely, expending her primary armament in the war's opening minutes. Now she had to survive long enough to see if the attack succeeded. The torpedoes ran true, their wakes visible in the morning light as they approached their targets. At 06:47 hours, a massive explosion erupted along Kumano's port side. The heavy cruiser staggered under the impact, her forward magazines detonating in a fireball that sent debris arcing across the sky. The 13,000-ton warship began listing immediately, her bow settling as flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. But Johnston's triumph was brief. At 06:50 hours, 3 14-inch shells from battleship Congo struck the destroyer almost simultaneously. The first shell penetrated the after-deck house, exploding among the 40mm gun mounts. The second struck the after smokestack, severing steam lines and reducing speed. The third shell hit the bridge area, destroying the chart house and wounding Commander Evans. The destroyer shuddered under the impacts, her speed dropping to 17 knots as damaged steam lines vented precious pressure. Fires erupted throughout the superstructure. The after 5-inch mount was knocked out completely. Half the anti-aircraft battery was destroyed. Johnston had absorbed damage that would have sunk most warships, yet she continued fighting. Evans, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, refused medical attention and remained on the bridge. "Damage report," he ordered, his voice steady despite his injuries. The reports were grim. The after-engine room was flooded. Number 4 boiler was offline. The main battery director was destroyed. Communications were disrupted throughout the ship. Johnston was hurt, badly hurt, but she was still afloat and still fighting. This was only the beginning. For the next 6 hours, Johnston would demonstrate what American naval engineering could accomplish when pushed beyond every conceivable limit. The destroyer that had charged alone into the most powerful enemy formation would refuse to surrender, refuse to retreat, and ultimately refuse to sink until she had given everything in defense of the escort carriers she was sworn to protect. The battle was far from over. Johnston's greatest trials lay ahead. At 0700 hours, with fires still raging throughout her superstructure and her speed reduced to a painful crawl, Johnston found herself in an impossible position. The Japanese formation had recovered from the initial torpedo attack and was bearing down on the vulnerable escort carriers with renewed fury. Admiral Sprague's desperate calls for air support had gone unanswered. The nearest American heavy units were still hours away. Taffy 3 stood alone against the most powerful surface force the Imperial Japanese Navy could assemble. Commander Evans assessed his options with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. Johnston's torpedo tubes were empty. Her after 5-inch mount was destroyed. Half her anti-aircraft battery lay in twisted wreckage. The destroyer had expended her primary offensive capability in the opening minutes of the engagement, yet the battle was far from over. The escort carriers were fleeing southward at their maximum speed of 18 knots, but the Japanese battleships could sustain 27 knots indefinitely. Mathematics and physics conspired against the Americans with ruthless precision. Evans made a decision that defied every principle of naval warfare. Instead of withdrawing to conduct damage control, instead of seeking the protection of smokescreens laid by other destroyers, Johnston would continue attacking. The destroyer turned toward the Japanese formation once again, her remaining guns training on targets that outweighed her 10-1. The crew responded with professionalism that bordered on the supernatural. Chief Gunner's mate, Paul Carr, had been wounded in the initial salvo, shrapnel tearing through his left shoulder and chest. He refused evacuation to the battle dressing station, instead directing ammunition handling from his position in the forward magazine. Blood soaked through his uniform, but his voice remained steady as he coordinated shell supply to the remaining 5-inch mounts. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, had lost his primary fire control director in the Japanese bombardment. The mechanical computers that calculated range and bearing were offline, their delicate mechanisms shattered by the concussion of near misses. Hagen reverted to manual fire control, using optical rangefinders and calculations performed by hand to direct Johnston's guns. It was gunnery as practiced in the previous century, yet the results were devastating. At 07:15 hours, Johnston engaged the heavy cruiser Chokai at a range of 14,000 yards. The destroyer's 3 remaining 5-inch guns fired in rapid succession, their shells arcing across the morning sky toward the Japanese flagship. The first salvo fell short, sending up geysers of white water along Chokai's starboard beam. Hagen adjusted elevation and deflection, compensating for Johnston's erratic speed and the cruiser's evasive maneuvers. The second salvo found its mark. 3 5-inch shells struck Chokai's bridge structure in rapid succession, the explosions obliterating the cruiser's primary fire control systems. Admiral Kurita's flagship staggered under the impacts, her superstructure erupting in flames as secondary explosions ripped through communication centers and radar installations. The 13,000-ton heavy cruiser began falling out of formation, her speed reduced as damage control parties fought to contain the spreading fires. Johnston's success came at a terrible price. The Japanese formation concentrated its fire on the audacious destroyer with methodical precision. Battleship Yamato's 18.1-inch rifles spoke with voices like thunder, their massive shells creating waterspouts that rose higher than Johnston's mast when they missed. Heavy cruiser Tone added her 8-inch guns to the bombardment, bracketing the destroyer with salvos that walked steadily closer to their target. At 07:22 hours, disaster struck. A 6-inch shell from light cruiser Yahagi penetrated Johnston's forward engine room, exploding among the high-pressure steam lines that fed her turbines. Superheated steam filled the compartment, killing 3 engineers instantly and forcing the evacuation of the entire space. Johnston's speed dropped to 12 knots as her remaining boiler struggled to maintain pressure. The destroyer began listing to starboard as flooding spread through damaged compartments. Chief Damage Controlman Joseph Stafford organized repair parties with desperate efficiency, directing the shoring of bulkheads and the pumping of flooded spaces. His men worked in near darkness, their battle lanterns providing the only illumination as they fought to keep their ship afloat. Water rose steadily in the forward compartments, but Johnston's honeycomb construction contained the flooding to non-vital areas. Commander Evans remained on the bridge despite wounds that would have hospitalized most men. Shrapnel from the bridge hit had opened a gash across his forehead, and blood ran steadily into his eyes. His left arm hung useless from shoulder wounds, but his right hand remained steady on the engine order telegraph. When his executive officer suggested withdrawing for medical treatment, Evans responded with words that would echo through naval history. "This ship will fight until she can no longer fight. We will not withdraw while our carriers remain in danger." The carriers were indeed in mortal peril. USS Gambier Bay had taken multiple hits from Japanese heavy cruisers, her flight deck torn open and her hangar spaces ablaze. USS St. Lo struggled to maintain formation speed as near misses opened seams in her unarmored hull. The escort carriers had launched every available aircraft, but their tiny air groups could not significantly impact the massive Japanese formation. Only the desperate attacks of the screening destroyers stood between the carriers and annihilation. Johnston continued her impossible fight, engaging targets of opportunity as they presented themselves. At 0730 hours, she encountered a squadron of Japanese destroyers attempting to flank the American formation. The enemy ships, confident in their numerical superiority, approached in line-ahead formation with their guns trained on the fleeing carriers. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, commanding destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, later described Johnston's attack on the Japanese destroyer squadron as the most audacious display of seamanship he had ever witnessed. The crippled American destroyer, listing heavily and trailing smoke from multiple fires, charged directly into the center of the enemy formation. Her remaining guns opened fire at point-blank range, creating a storm of steel that shattered the Japanese attack formation. The lead Japanese destroyer took 3 direct hits amidships, her magazines exploding in a fireball that illuminated the morning sky. The second destroyer, attempting to avoid the wreckage of her consort, collided with a third ship in the formation. Within minutes, Johnston had single-handedly disrupted an attack that could have destroyed the escort carriers. But the destroyer's ammunition was running dangerously low. The rapid firing of the past hour had exhausted much of her 5-inch shell supply, and the damaged handling rooms could not maintain the previous rate of fire. Chief Carr, now barely conscious from blood loss, directed his remaining men in distributing the last shells from the forward magazine. Each round would have to count, for there might not be another opportunity to resupply. At 0745 hours, Johnston found herself isolated from the other American ships, surrounded by Japanese cruisers that had finally managed to coordinate their attack. Heavy cruiser Tone approached from the starboard quarter, her 8-inch guns trained on the wounded destroyer. Light cruiser Yahagi closed from port, her rapid-fire 6-inch battery ready to finish what her earlier hits had started. From ahead, another heavy cruiser emerged from the smoke, her guns already firing. Commander Evans faced the moment every destroyer captain dreaded, trapped by superior forces with no avenue of escape. Johnston's speed was down to 8 knots, her list increasing as flooding spread through damaged compartments. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted. Her crew was decimated by casualties. By every rational measure, the time had come to surrender or scuttle. Evans chose neither option. Instead, he ordered Johnston's helm hard over, turning the destroyer directly toward the nearest Japanese cruiser. If his ship was going to die, she would die fighting, taking as many enemies with her as possible. The mathematics of destruction had been rewritten by American courage and Japanese overconfidence. But the final equation remained to be solved. The engagement that followed would demonstrate the ultimate capabilities of American naval engineering and the extraordinary courage of the men who operated these weapons of war. Johnston's final hour would prove that sometimes the ship that refuses to surrender can accomplish the impossible, even when facing odds that should guarantee defeat. The final phase of Johnston's battle began at 0800 hours, when the destroyer found herself completely surrounded by Japanese heavy cruisers. Commander Evans, his vision blurred by blood from multiple head wounds, could see enemy ships closing from every direction. Tone had positioned herself off the starboard beam, her 8-inch guns elevated for the killing blow. Yahagi approached from port, her crew confident that the crippled American destroyer could offer no further resistance. From directly ahead, heavy cruiser Chikuma emerged from her own smoke screen, her forward turrets already trained on Johnston's bridge. What happened next defied every principle of naval warfare that Japanese commanders had studied at the Naval War College. Instead of striking colors or attempting to surrender, Johnston's remaining crew prepared for one final act of defiance. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Carr, barely conscious and supported by 2 seamen, dragged himself to the forward 5-inch mount. The gun had been firing manually since the director system was destroyed, but it still had shells in the ready service rings. Lieutenant Hagen, calculating ranges by eye and compensating for Johnston's increasing list, selected the most dangerous target. Heavy cruiser Tone displaced 15,000 tons and carried 10 8-inch guns in 5 turrets. Her armor could withstand destroyer gunfire under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. Johnston was close enough that her shells would strike at nearly flat trajectories, potentially penetrating areas of thinner plating. At 0803 hours, Johnston's forward mount fired its final salvo. 3 5-inch shells struck Tone's forward superstructure in rapid succession, the impacts occurring within seconds of each other. The first shell penetrated the cruiser's bridge, killing her captain and most of the command staff instantly. The second shell destroyed the main battery director, leaving the turret crews to operate independently. The third shell struck the forward rangefinder, blinding the cruiser's gunnery control. Tone staggered under the impacts, her return fire becoming erratic as confusion spread through her surviving crew. The heavy cruiser began turning away from Johnston, her commander's death having left the ship without effective leadership at the critical moment. One crippled American destroyer had neutralized a heavy cruiser through sheer audacity and precision gunnery, but Johnston's ammunition was finally exhausted. The forward mount had fired its last shell, and the after magazines were flooded beyond recovery. Commander Evans faced the reality that every naval officer dreaded. His ship could no longer fight, but she could still serve. The destroyer became a torpedo magnet, drawing Japanese fire away from the vulnerable escort carriers that were still fleeing southward. The Japanese commanders, frustrated by their inability to close with the American carriers, concentrated their fury on the defiant destroyer. Chikuma's 8-inch guns fired at point-blank range, their shells striking Johnston's hull below the waterline. The explosions tore massive holes in the destroyer's side, flooding spreading rapidly through compartments that had already been weakened by previous damage. At 0815 hours, a direct hit from Yahagi's 6-inch battery struck Johnston's forward magazine. The explosion that followed lifted the destroyer's bow completely out of the water, her forward section disappearing in a fireball that could be seen from 20 miles away. When the smoke cleared, Johnston's forecastle had been blown away, leaving twisted metal where her forward 5-inch mount had stood just moments before. Chief Damage Controlman Stafford reported to the bridge that flooding was now beyond control. The forward bulkheads had failed completely, and water was rising in the engine spaces despite every effort to contain it. Johnston's list increased to 30 degrees as her damaged compartments filled with seawater. The destroyer's death was now inevitable, but her crew continued their duties with mechanical precision. Commander Evans, supported by 2 seamen as his wounds finally overcame his strength, gave his final orders with voice that remained steady despite the chaos around him. All stop. Prepare to abandon ship. Destroy all classified material. Every man for himself when she goes down. The crew responded with discipline that would have impressed peacetime inspectors. Radioman McCrane smashed the encryption equipment with an axe before destroying his codebooks. Signalmen burned their recognition signals and operational orders. Gunners' mates disabled the remaining weapons to prevent their capture. Even as Johnston listed further to starboard, her men performed their final duties with professional competence. At 0945 hours, USS Johnston rolled over and slipped beneath the waters of Leyte Gulf, taking with her 186 officers and men who had given everything in defense of their mission. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. The escort carriers survived. The Japanese center force, bloodied and confused by the ferocious resistance of Taffy 3, withdrew without accomplishing their objective. Commander Ernest Evans and his destroyer had proven that courage and engineering excellence could triumph over overwhelming odds. Johnston's 6-hour battle against impossible forces stands as testament to what American naval power could accomplish when pushed beyond every conceivable limit. The destroyer that refused to die had saved an entire task force through sheer determination to fight.